Wilderness here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In this segment, we stay in Montana for part two of my interview with the naturalist, adventurer, writer Doug Peacock, the husband of our last guest, Andrea Peacock. His books include Grizzly Years, In Search of the American Wilderness. I first interviewed Doug and Andrea last month in Bozeman, Montana, about their involvement in the fight to protect the state's grizzly bears and their friendship with the late writer Edward Abbey. One of Abbey's most famous characters, Hey Duke, from his book The Monkey Wrench Gang, was based on Doug Peacock. Well, after the Democracy Now! Broadcast ended in Bozeman, Doug stayed in the studio to talk more about the grizzly bear at Abbey and his time serving in Vietnam and coming home. Doug's 2 tours in Vietnam have had a profound effect on his life. He was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder shortly after his return from Vietnam. He became deeply involved in environmental causes, which continues today. In this part of the interview, Doug Peacock begins by explaining the connection between his time in Vietnam and his involvement with the plight of the grizzly bear.
Well, when I first ran into grizzly bears, I didn't know anything about them at all. And it was just a few months after I'd come back from Vietnam, and I was no good around people, so I camped out in the Rocky Mountains. And I had a malaria attack way down in the Wind River Range, and I decided that I needed to go someplace where the weather was better and the terrain a little flatter. So I went to Yellowstone Park, and I was going to go back and soak in the hot springs and just kind of regain my health from this, a paroxysm where I had a fever of 105.5, and that's the last note I made, and I was out of it for 2 or 3 days alone in a sleeping bag in a tent. So anyway, I was soaking in a hot spring one day in October in Yellowstone Park, and it was a little creek actually, where you could get any temperature you want by going upstream or downstream. Starts out boiling, ends up tepid, so and I was sitting there soaking in this little tiny hot spring. It's only about this wide, and off to my right, I caught movement. It was a mother grizzly with 2 yearling cubs out in this meadow about 200 feet away, and I said, damn. I didn't know anything about grizzlies except you're supposed to stay away from mothers with cubs. So I decided I was going to climb a tree. And so when the bears weren't looking, or they were facing the other direction, I turned, and there was a little lodgepole pine right on the bank of this creek, so it was only like 5 feet away. Well, I stood up, and the whirlpool-like effect of the hot water caused me to black out. And I slammed in the tree. I cut a great gash in my forehead, and blood's dripping down, but I was so terrified. I scrambled up the top of this tree anyway. And when I got to the top of the tree, I realized that it was really not much bigger than a Christmas tree, Anyway, and it was cold. The wind was blowing. It was October, and there was a 40-mile-an-hour wind. And, to make a long story short, this mother grizzly and her 2 yearling cubs grazed in this meadow, coming within 20 feet of my stupid little tree, and never looked at me. They knew I was there. But anyway, I'm sitting up there, this naked, blue and bleeding thing, clinging to the top of a little lodgepole pine tree like some kind of silly bird, And anyway, those were the first bears that really got my attention. That's how I started.
Now, you've had even closer encounters.
Oh yeah, lots of them. And, the essence of a grizzly bear encounter, that's when you and the bear become aware of one another. There's so much misunderstanding about the nature of a grizzly bear encounter, even among the professionals. I was at their meeting of the interagency grizzly bear study team and the coordinating committee, and there's no real definition here because hunters have killed a ton of grizzlies, charging grizzlies. The vast majority, and I mean like 80% or something, bears that charge humans are mothers who have cubs or other young they are protecting. It is always the fault of the human being who, guileless or not, gets too close to a mother grizzly and then makes a sudden move, and the grizzly will a mother grizzly, that'll provoke a charge. And it's happened to me a lot. And I've always stood my ground. I don't look at the bear. Sometimes I hold my arms out and I talk. It doesn't matter what you say, I don't think, but
Why don't you look at the bear?
Because that's confrontational. When grizzlies do this, it is a challenge. So I turn my head way off to the side. And one of those bears, and again, it was all my fault. I wasn't paying attention. Early on, I made a lot of mistakes. That's how I learned about grizzlies, basically by screwing up a lot and living through it so far. But one of those, I was charged about 34 times, and the vast majority of those were mothers, and they all stopped short. One skidded to a stop like this about 5 feet away, and it kind of reached out her nose as if to sniff me. And others came right at me and veered off at 12 foot away. But again, I was just holding on. So a bear has never touched me. And no one gives that kind of advice. And right now, you know, they talk about hunter education. Well, you know, nobody asks anything of we humans who go into grizzly country. I mean, that's a voluntary decision. I think the onus is upon us to know something about bears and behave accordingly. And, you know, no one is asking anything. No, we're not asking any sacrifices of hunters or anybody else that goes in the wilderness, and we should be. You know, the bears have always been there. They're not there because they like it. It's because we shot them out every place else. And I think the least we can do as fellow omnivores and human beings is to grant them, you know, that tiny amount of grace they need to live out their own lives. And the element of risk, you know, is terribly important. I've spent a lot of my life fighting to protect it, and we need to accept it.
Doug Peacock, you've described another experience where a grizzly bear was, what, like 20 feet away from you? Encounter when you're not sure if you're going to make it.
Well, I'm trying to think which one that is, but because there's several, you know. And
take your pick.
Well, you know, when I was starting out, I decided I was going to make a film record of grizzly bears. I had an old spring-wound Bolex camera, you know, and in Yellowstone in the early 70s, it was hard to find a grizzly. I mean, we knocked that population down to we don't know how many, maybe 150 bears, you know, but really, so you didn't see them.
What kills them?
Human beings, period. That's it. That's their only natural enemy is us. Occasionally, grizzlies, this is very rare, but it has been documented, you know, male grizzlies will kill young bears and cubs sometimes. And, but anyway, you know, the vast majority of grizzly bear mortality is human caused. Mm-hmm. They live to be long, you know, they live to be 30 years old in the wild, reproductive, you know, have cubs at 29, 30. But anyway, you were asking me about this this encounter. Well, anyway, I was filming grizzlies, and I spotted a mother with a cub of the year in Yellowstone Park. I decided I was going to sneak up on her and get a picture, and there was a strong wind blowing, and I could kind of see her. So every time her back, she couldn't hear me at all. And the wind was blowing right at me. It was perfect. So I stalked across this meadow. There's a little dead snag in that thing. And about 20 feet away from the tree line. Well, you know, I lost track of the grizzly for a minute, and you know, the wind was blowing, so she couldn't hear me. And I was about to make a move, and all of a sudden there was a mother grizzly in the tree line, 20 feet away, with her cub. And she looked at me, and I didn't move a muscle. I mean, I didn't blink, literally. And she looked at me, and she reared, and she knew there was something out there. But grizzly bears usually identify things with their nose, and you could see her agitation. Grizzly bear's jaw, they look off to the side, but I never moved, and she couldn't smell me. And I don't think she ever was sure quite what I was, except that I was motionless for about, almost a minute. And she perceived that I was no threat to her cub. Otherwise, she would have nailed me. Had I done like this, she would have nailed me. And again, it's always your fault when you get too close to a grizzly.
Doug, you talk about averting their eyes, but also putting your arms out. Why your arms out?
I think it makes you look a little bigger. There's no real sound logic in that, you know. Go.
Why did you find comfort in grizzlies coming back from Vietnam?
Mainly because they got you out of your own mind. You know, if you put on a Kelly pack and you hike in Colorado or California, you're top dog. You know, you walk down the trail, you think about your girlfriend or your portfolio or I don't know what. In grizzly country, you can't do that because there's something out there that, if it chose, could kill and eat you at any time it wanted to. And just having to take that into stock, you know, totally and fundamentally just changes the ambience of a place. All of a sudden, you're not top dog, and you look a little more closely. You walk like an animal. You scent the wind.